Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here. I'm Ross, Virginia. I direct the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth, also a faculty member in the Environmental Studies program. And I'm very pleased and honored today to introduce our lecture by Dr. Gabrielle Slowey, the inaugural holder of the Fulbright Canada Visiting Research Chair in Arctic Studies at Dartmouth. That's quite a title, I think. And this is a very exciting thing for me and for all of us. This is the first Fulbright chair at Dartmouth. And this chair is focused on understanding the critical issues confronting the Arctic, its environment, and its peoples. And I think this is just a great match with Dartmouth. John Sloan Dickey was Dartmouth's 12th president. And he took a very special interest in U.S. and Canada relations and policy issues, and he was a true friend and lover of the North. So I think it's especially fitting that this Canada Fulbright Chair is based within the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and it connects the U.S. to Canada and Arctic. It's just like the trifecta, the most perfect thing for me, certainly. So before I actually introduce Professor Gabrielle Slowey, I want to welcome some colleagues and friends from Canada who are here today to celebrate your accomplishments and see the good work that you've been doing, both in Canada but also here at Dartmouth. So first up, we have a friend and guest from Fulbright Canada. I've had the special opportunity to work very closely with the Fulbright office in Canada as a lead scholar for the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, and Canada's been one of the central partners and players in this very, I think, interesting and unique opportunity. The CEO of Fulbright Canada is Dr. Michael Hawes, and the program manager is Mr. Brad Hector. And during the Fulbright Arctic program, I've been able to travel with our colleagues in Canada and other Fulbright scholars to Baffin Island and Ottawa in Canada. We reached Finland, Iceland, Alaska, and Washington, D.C. So the Arctic is connected to every cool place in the world. So here to fill us in a little bit and represent Fulbright Canada is Mr. Brad Hector, Program Manager. Brad, welcome to Dartmouth.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to see a very large turnout, especially considering the demands people have. I know exams are coming up in a couple of weeks, and I appreciate the time you set aside to hear what Gabrielle has to say. The Fulbright program, hopefully a lot of you are familiar with it. If not, I've just got a couple of things to say about it, and it's the flagship international educational exchange program that's sponsored by the United States government. And it's designed to increase mutual understanding between the peoples of the United States and other countries around the world. For 70 years, the Fulbright program's been running. We just had our 70th anniversary, and it's impacted local communities and the world through innovative and inclusive educational opportunities for current and future leaders. We target outstanding Americans and Canadian students and scholars through the Canada-US Fulbright program. We actually have one of our students from last year, Leah Sarson, who has enjoyed us so much she's stayed here. And I understand you've been rather successful. You've just received a Shirk Award. Congratulations. So she'll be continuing postdoc activities here at Dartmouth, and I wish you every success in that. There's also a Dartmouth student, Joshua Tupler, who's currently in Canada right now at Queen's University in their Center for International and Defense Policy. So he's continuing on doing his research there, and I understand he just recently received a Yangqing scholarship, which is apparently quite competitive, going off to Beijing, China. So I'm glad to see he's being recognized for his work and his successes and his interests. In addition to our traditional scholar award, Dr. Virginia had mentioned there's the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. This is a program that was just introduced last year, and it focuses on Arctic Council member states and pulls together a group of scholars and researchers for a collaborative interdisciplinary research program to consider policy questions that are relevant to the Arctic nations' shared interests. This was a very big get. We've been looking at ways to improve visibility, improve collaboration, And then there was a program called the Nexus program, which was focused on Western Hemisphere. But our CEO came up with an idea of this Arctic Council. And it was incredibly successful. And as Ross mentioned, there's a lot of travel and a lot of input. And we're really happy to see that move forward. The second year has just been confirmed, and again, we're very happy to have Ross being our co-lead scholar on the next cycle, and we're hoping to have more information about that and launch that in the coming months. So thank you again, Ross, for helping out with that. In addition to our traditional scholars program, we also have the visiting chairs program. This is a partnership with select universities across Canada and the United States, where it's more than just a research opportunity. The scholars are invited on campus to have a much more involved program where they are directly involved with the academic community, the local community, with the additional support from the host institution. And we definitely encourage public lectures such as this to help elevate the prominence of our scholar, as well as increase value to the host institution. We are very pleased to, as Ross mentioned, this is our very first Arctic chair, chair in Arctic Studies being hosted here at Dartmouth University, at Dartmouth College. And our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Gabrielle Slowey, was a very inspired choice. So I thank you for applying to this and being selected. And I understand it's been a very successful visit for you so far. Our scholars are conducting important research on issues and policies of mutual interest for our two countries. And especially now, our Fulbright scholars have become a great resource for understanding the recent events and their future impacts. We run this program for one very simple reason: to expand the freedom of fellowship, ideas, and scholarship. So thank you, and I hope this continues.
Thank you very much, Brad. And I think you get a sense of how important the Fulbright program is as one of the leading examples of science diplomacy globally. And Dartmouth is very pleased to participate and partner with Canada in this effort. I think everyone in this room understands the importance of the relationship between the United States and Canada on almost any dimension one can imagine. And it's a very special opportunity to be able to introduce, and an honor to introduce Mr. David Alward, the Consul General of Canada to New England. Mr. Alward was appointed as Consul General in May of 2015, and he serves as Canada's principal and primary contact in the New England region, and that includes states of Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont, which means you probably spend a lot of time driving as well. It's not an easy region to cover any other way. He has a very distinguished career of service to his country, to Canada, and his current responsibilities connect to all of that experience. Consul General Alward was first elected to the Legislative Assembly in New Brunswick in 1999, was sworn in as Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Aquaculture in 2003, and took the oath of office to become the 32nd Premier of New Brunswick in 2010. As Canada's lead diplomat in the New England region, he has a very broad and complicated and exciting portfolio. It covers trade, environment, economic relations, education. So he's the point person for many of these vital things that we see. And I should add that with him today is Mark Jacques. Mark's sitting over here as well. Mark has been working with the Dickey Center in Dartmouth for quite a long time. I think 10 years ago we started with the International Polar Year, and it's continued. Mark's portfolio is to encourage partnerships and relationships between U.S. and Canadian universities. And so, Mark, it's really great to have you here today. So it's my honor again to introduce the Consul General of Canada to New England, Mr. David Alward.
Very much. Thank you, Dr. Virginia. Great to see everybody here this afternoon. Just yesterday, Mark and I were with Brad, And we have another Fulbright scholar with us today as well. We were at Norwich University, not too far from here, and hearing on it from another presentation. So I'd also like to welcome Dr. Pierre Jolicoeur, who's with us today as well. Really pleased to be back here this year again, following up really from the announcement last year of the inaugural chair. And certainly very pleased at the work that is going on with Dartmouth and the collaboration with Canada. I want to congratulate Dr. Slowey. We had a chance to connect for a few minutes before, and we realized we have a whole lot in common. She did her master's program in the province where I'm from at University of New Brunswick, and her work with Indigenous peoples certainly has touched many of the same lives as who I've connected with as well. So looking really very much forward to your presentation today. A few months ago, we were here as well for the announcement of the Arthur Irving Institute for Energy and Society and the studies that will be taking place here. And again, many of the same things, points of connection with what's taking place. I just have a couple of quick comments around the Arctic and Canada. And I certainly hope that everyone understands here just how significant a priority the Arctic is for the Government of Canada. Certainly, it's a very important and valuable part of our heritage, our national identity, and very importantly, our future. There is something called the Canada Arctic Strategy, and it's really a four-part piece, 4 pillars to it. Each of them are different, but they're all equally important. They specifically are exercising Canada's sovereignty, promoting economic and social development, protecting Canada's environmental heritage, and improving and devolving governance. As part of this as well, it speaks to the cooperation, the international cooperation that is so important when it comes to each of those aspects of the Arctic and the work that is going on currently between Canada and the US, and very importantly, our academic leaders and our researchers will be vital for both of our countries as we go forward. One last comment, and certainly looking forward to hearing from Gabrielle. This is Canada's 150th birthday this year. And I think if any of you are Canadians, I know for myself, in many ways, I'm very proud and feel very blessed to be Canadian. So I have 150th anniversary pins for Ross and for Brad and for Gabrielle, and just wish you well. And I hope everybody in the room over the next few months takes an opportunity to come party with us, because that'll be a pretty good year. Thank you. Yours isn't quite as depending on how interesting your piece is. Maybe
Well, David, thank you for that. And I think we're going to have to rent a big bus, bring all these people up to Canada for this party. So happy 150th. Very, very much appreciated. Again, thank you to our Canadian colleagues and friends for being here for this. And you highlighted the importance of the Arctic to Canada, but also to the U.S. And next week, the Arctic Council will be meeting in Fairbanks, Alaska for the ministerial meeting where the United States hands over its chairmanship and leadership role to Finland. And so I'll be there and I'll be able to interact with our Canadian colleagues there, and we're happy to have you here today. So now I guess on with the main attraction here, and I get to introduce our Fulbright scholar, or Canadian visiting scholar, Dr. Gabrielle Slowey. She's director of the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies at York University, which is in Toronto, if you're a little vague on your Canadian geography. And she's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. She teaches a wide range of courses which touch on Canadian, Aboriginal, and Arctic politics, you'll see that in her presentation today. Her current research really works at the intersection of ecology, governance, resource extraction, Indigenous peoples, and relationships with the state. And that's a lot of different things to connect, but she does this very well. I think one of the very important features of her work is a research approach, which involves direct engagement with communities. It's community-driven. The questions come from the needs of peoples and how they can live a more sustainable life in the place that matters to them. Her current research is looking at the pressures around development associated with shale gas reserves and oil sands in Western Canada, and the interactions between extractive industries and local communities. She's the author of a really interesting and important book on this topic, Navigating Neoliberalism, Self-Determination in the Mikisew Cree First Nation. She has many peer-reviewed papers, and I guess I should say that maybe the most distinctive thing about Gabrielle's visit here is her boundless energy and enthusiasm for her work, her ability to engage with students and faculty from multiple departments, Native American Studies, Environmental Studies, Government, and the connections of these issues, which are very central to us right now. We've heard about the Irving Institute and the need for understanding our relationships with energy and people and environment. And Gabrielle, you cover all of that so very well. So I would like to say that following this talk, there's going to be a reception upstairs at the Dickey Center, a wine and cheese reception. So please, you're all welcome. Please join us up there afterwards. So the presentation today focuses on, I think, some issues that are timely, relevant, and also difficult. And the title of her presentation is Pipelines, Politics, and Protest in Arctic Perspective. Welcome, Dr. Gabrielle Slowey.
Mic up here. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is that good to go? Great. Well, thank you all so very much. I am absolutely thrilled to be here and feel myself incredibly lucky to be the inaugural Fulbright Chair in Arctic Studies here at Dartmouth. I actually left New Brunswick in my master's because I was hired by the Mikisew Cree out of my master's to go be a self-government officer in Alberta, which is really where I got my Arctic start. So before we begin today, I'd actually like to acknowledge the traditional lands upon which Dartmouth is founded on the Abenaki territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy. I'd also like to take a moment to honor the 4 hunters from Fort Chipewyan who unfortunately went out in the land last weekend, unfortunately perished. The community has been very upset and has finally come to accept that they found the bodies, and so my thoughts and prayers are with the community of Fort Chipewyan tonight. Okay. Well, as we know, the Arctic is home to approximately 4 million people, counting numerous ethnicities among its inhabitants. More than 10% of the total population living in the Arctic is comprised of Indigenous peoples. In modern times, rapid and extensive changes have brought about opportunities, but also challenges to peoples and places in the North, including climate change, industrial extraction, pollution, globalization, migration, food, water insecurity, and widening socioeconomic gaps. Oops. Unlike the oh, sorry, wrong one. I missed a page. Oh. The Arctic, sorry, I mentioned this. So this is home, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. The Arctic is home to, like I said, approximately 4 million people. So Canada has asserted its own view of the North as a national territory, but Northern Canada is an Indigenous landscape. The North is inherently about the people, the Inuit, other Aboriginal peoples and Northerners who have made the North their home, and the Canadians in other parts of the country who recognize the Arctic as part of our shared heritage and identity. Inuit means people in Inuktitut, have occupied Canada's Arctic lands and waterways for millennia. Long before the arrival of Europeans, Inuit hunters, fishers, and their families moved with the seasons and developed a unique culture and a way of life deeply rooted in this vast land. The lands just south of the Arctic Circle, so you can see the Arctic Circle delineated on the map, have been occupied for thousands of years by the ancestors of today's Indigenous peoples, including the Dene, Gwich'in, Cree, and Métis. The Indigenous peoples live in communities across the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and the northern border regions of mainland provinces. Over the past 200 years, also, some non-Indigenous residents from southern Canada and other parts of the world have chosen to make the North their home. Okay, now we're on track. Unlike in the South, Indigenous peoples comprise a substantial portion of the northern population, often outnumbering non-Aboriginal people. According to a recent census, the Inuit population in Canada numbers approximately 50,000. The majority of Inuit live in one of 4 regions known collectively as Inuit Nunat, the Inuktitut expression for Inuit homeland. So they live in Nunavik, Nunavut, Nunatsiavut, and Inuvialuit. Inuit comprise roughly 85% of the population of the territory of Nunavut and also represent the majority in the homelands of Nunavik and Nunatsiavut. The demographic, economic, and social conditions of Northern Aboriginal peoples are notably different from those of the Canadian population and other Northerners. The most striking demographic feature of Northern Aboriginal peoples is the rapidly growing youthful population. For example, while the median age for Canadian population as a whole is about 40 years, the average for Inuit is 22 years, so half. The Inuit population also has the highest proportion of young people among Indigenous groups. In Nunavik, for example, 56% of the population is under the age of 25, and 86% is younger than 45. Population projections suggest that Indigenous peoples aged 2029 will account for 40% of the young adult population in the Yukon and 60% of young adults in the Northwest Territories over the coming decades. And in Nunavut, more than 80% of the population is aged between 20 and 29 years of age. So you can see this youthful structure of the northern population has significant policy implications and will likely set the stage for some important challenges in the near future. Territorial Indigenous governments acknowledge that they must find creative ways to find employment opportunities, increase education, and increase income levels to assist young Indigenous Northerners as they make the transition, whether it be from school to wage or traditional economies. In terms of politics, as recently as a few decades ago, federally appointed commissioners oversaw decisions about all aspects of life in the North. Today, the territories are increasingly taking up jurisdiction powers and responsibilities similar to those in the provinces. So previously, where the provinces have autonomy and sovereignty, the territories have been historically under the direct control of our federal government. This is changing with these new arrangements. Indigenous peoples throughout the North have negotiated what we call land claim and self-government agreements that give them institutions and resources to greater self-sufficiency. The increasing political maturity and certainty in the North are helping to encourage private sector companies to explore and develop the region's vast natural resources and to diversify the region's economies. The settlement of these claims is also an important role for supporting economic well-being of Indigenous peoples. Research suggests that communities that have successfully negotiated access to and jurisdiction over lands and resources enjoy greater economic benefits than communities that have not concluded land claim agreements. Land and cash transfers to Indigenous peoples resulting from these settlements are important drivers in the northern economy. Apart from securing jurisdiction over defined land base and resource, land claim agreements generally contain a variety of economic development provisions, such as resource sharing agreements, impact benefit agreements, and these are designed to help the community secure employment opportunities and derive commercial benefits from many mining developments in their traditional territories. As a result of these agreements and the access to investment capital, there are a growing number of Indigenous businesses in the North, including airlines or fisheries and transportation companies. So while it's interesting, while historically Indigenous peoples have not always had a voice in the development occurring within their territory, their land has been central. And to some extent, this is changing. Critical to all this, of course, is that these agreements are enshrined in the Canadian Constitution. Just as the right to bear arms, just as the freedom of speech is protected in the American Constitution, so too are treaty rights and land claims protected and enshrined in our Canadian Constitution. Another important note is that these governance agreements have implications for any future extraction of resources. You see, in Canada, the Crown, be it the province or the federal government, owns the resources, not the individuals. And with some of these agreements, some of these responsibilities are even transferred to the First Nations or Indigenous groups. So what this means, in effect, for a company or industry that may want to come into the Canadian Arctic or anywhere else technically across the country, they now have to negotiate not specifically or alone with the Crown, but increasingly these industries are now going directly to the communities and the Indigenous groups on whose lands the development will occur. So that sort of sets the stage for some of the political dynamics of what's going on. So what's life like in the Canadian Arctic today? Many Northern Aboriginal peoples continue to rely on traditional economy for self-sufficiency. However, as temperatures rise in the Arctic, the ability to procure country foods becomes more difficult, and food security is threatened. Recognizing that environmental stewardship is vital to the overall health and viability of the Northern economy, Northern Indigenous leaders have called on the federal government to assist Inuit and other Indigenous peoples in adapting to the effects of global warming. In Canada's Arctic region, and peoples in the north also face considerable social and economic challenges and tend to fare worse on a range of social and economic indicators in comparison with their non-Indigenous counterparts. A recent survey of living conditions in the Arctic reported a high incidence of social problems such as unemployment, and alcohol abuse, family abuse, and sexual abuse in the north. Poor economies and a loss of control over traditional lands and resources are one of these reasons. It was as recently as the 1970s that many of these families met their needs exclusively through traditional economic means or subsistence living. So since then, two key events have rendered Inuit dependent on wage labor and transfers. First, the Canadian government's attempt to modernize and civilize Inuit by sending them to residential boarding schools and centralizing them in permanent communities. This created greater dependency on the government. Second, the United States and European Union's ban on the importation of sealskins undermined the ability of Inuit to access the cash economy through independent commodity production. Notably, recent proposals to uplist status of polar bears to endangered species will promise to repeat this process. Because of this, territories in the Canadian Arctic, like Nunavut, are in a situation where renewable resource harvesting can no longer exclusively meet their needs as a people, and an increasing number of Inuit do not have access to the harvesting economy. Yet, the economic contribution of traditional harvesting activities is often poorly captured or misunderstood. The emphasis is on market or public sector economies, such that the traditional sector is often overlooked despite its importance for these people, especially in isolated areas. Statistics Canada estimates that roughly $40 million of country food is produced annually by Inuit alone. So although it is difficult to quantify precisely the value of the traditional economy in monetary terms, there are tangible quality of life benefits as well as benefits of nutritious food, cultural heritage, and some economic returns. For Inuit living in Northern Territories, supporting greater access to country foods and participation in the traditional economy take on greater significance when one considers that by far the greatest share of personal debt in the North is linked to the purchase of food. As a result, some Inuit are unable to buy the basic dietary requirements of life. In such cases, families obtain essential dietary staples through strong ties to the land and access to country food. Now you may be saying, well, what do you mean their biggest personal debt is tied to the price of food? Hunger in the Arctic is a real problem, primarily due to the high cost of foods. So here you see milk at $4, a carton of orange juice at $10, margarine for $30, spaghetti, which we pay maybe 99 cents for, $13. Cheese Whiz, an important staple for kids, $30. Honey, $11. And good old cranberry juice, $40. And you'll note that none of these are actually fresh foods, which of course are also astronomical. You might pay something like $8 or $9 for, anything like a small bag of carrots in Arctic Bay. And don't forget, in these communities, you're talking about one store, so there's no competition and the high cost of freight. Now, add to this Statistics indicate an unemployment rate among the Indigenous population of the Yukon is more than double the territorial average, 28% versus 11%, and a median household income of $40,000 for Indigenous peoples compared to $60,000 for the rest of all the Yukoners. Rates of university graduation for Indigenous peoples of the Northwest Territories are sharply lower than for the territory as a whole, and less than 1/4 of Indigenous peoples have a high school leaving certificate. Despite an increased reliance on wage labor, unemployment rates in Nunavut remain high. Public sector and Inuit organization jobs are not available in large numbers in all communities, and a lack of education and relevant experience bars Inuit from many of these positions. As a result, there is significant support for resource extraction in principle for many Inuit who see it as a potential solution to many of the Inuits' unemployment problems. Because Inuit are dependent on the wage labor market, there are few opportunities for waged work in the north. However, the negative impacts of extraction results in substantial political conflict over particular types of extraction or particular proposed projects. Finally, Nunavut is the only region that earns a D- grade with an average suicide rate that is 3 times higher than the worst-ranked peer country, Japan, and 6 times higher than the Canadian average. Generally, Indigenous peoples have higher mortality and suicide rates, as well as lower education and income levels than their non-Indigenous counterparts. The suicide rate among Inuit is supposedly 11 times higher than the national average, and the life expectancy is 15 years lower than Canadians. Inuit households are also likely to be more overcrowded, 20% falling below the housing standards established by the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Listed employment opportunities and low rates of educational attainment are also key issues. All of this raises that important question. Could extraction provide a potential economic base for a territory like Nunavut? Well, from the development of world-class mines and massive oil and gas reserves to the growth of commercial fisheries to a thriving tourism that attracts visitors from around the globe, the enormous economic potential of the North is being unlocked. Areas that require urgent attention, such as infrastructure, housing, and education, are being addressed to help ensure Northerners are positioned to seize these unprecedented opportunities. International interest in the North has intensified because of the potential for resource development, the opening of new transportation routes, and the growing impacts of climate change. In September 2007, satellite images verified that the Northwest Passage had less than 10% ice coverage, making it, by all definitions, fully navigable for several weeks. This was well ahead of most recent forecasts. Although the Northwest Passage is not expected to be a safe or reliable transportation route in the near future, reduced ice coverage and longer periods of navigability may result in an increased number of ships undertaking destination travel for tourism, resource exploration, or development. Mining projects and major projects such as the Mackenzie Gas Project are the cornerstones of sustained economic activity in the North and are promised as solutions key to building prosperous Indigenous and Northern communities. This particular pipeline is a proposed project to transport natural gas from the Beaufort Sea through Canada's Northwest Territories to tie into gas pipelines in northern Alberta. The project was first proposed in the 1970s, but was scrapped following an inquiry by Justice Thomas Berger. The project was resurrected in 2004 with a new proposal to transport gas through the sensitive Arctic tundra. Probabilistic estimates of hydrocarbons in the Mackenzie Delta and Beaufort Sea regions project that there are natural gas reserves. Mackenzie Gas Project, this project proposes to develop natural gas fields in the Mackenzie Delta and deliver natural gas through a pipeline system across the valley. Many of you may not be aware, but there's also a lot of diamond mining going on in Canada's north. It's now a $2 billion a year industry, which is about half the economy of the Northwest Territories. The Mackenzie Gas Project, add to that, now estimated over $16 billion, has promised to provide direct benefits to Indigenous communities through the development of a new model of Indigenous participation. We have something in Canada called the Aboriginal Pipeline Group, which provides for Indigenous participation in the developing economy, notably through a part ownership position in the project. In addition to onshore exploration and development, there is renewed interest in offshore, including a new era of oil and gas exploration in the deep waters of the Beaufort. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Beaufort is in Canada's Arctic between the Northwest Territories, Yukon, and the United States. Now, this is another region that has a long history of a lot of activity. It began in the 60s, and there have been a number of wells. But what's fascinating to me, and I'm going to show you a timeline now of the accelerated pace of interest in this region. So this is the oil and gas dispositions, the active licenses in the 1980s, with pink being significant discovery, yellow being exploration, and blue, purple if you want, being production licenses. So that's the 1980s, the 90s, the early 2000, 2006, and this is the most recent. So the large-scale projects already underway barely scratch the surface of the North's immense mineral, petroleum, hydro, and ocean resources. The full extent of these resources and the potential of the Arctic is still largely unknown. The Government of Canada announced a significant new geomapping effort that will combine the latest technology with geoscientific analysis methods to build our understanding of the geology of Canada's north, including the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The results of this work will highlight areas of mineral and petroleum potential and lead to more engagement with Indigenous and northern communities. But extraction costs in the Arctic, if you thought food was expensive, extraction costs to operate and drill are incredibly expensive. There's a lack of local labor, so it's expensive to fly in and out labor. There's a lack of local infrastructure, roads, airstrips, power plants. Everything must be constructed, everything must be hauled up north. Lack of transportation, communication linkages. Don't get me started on the internet challenges of being in the Arctic. And all, like I said, everything has to be shipped up there. This makes it a jurisdiction that is particularly sensitive to the boom and bust cycles. A small change in a resource value can render a project in the Arctic unprofitable. That would have maybe negligible effects on another area that might be more connected, if you will. So there's a lot of anticipation and hopes tied to the potential of resource activity in the Arctic. In December 2016, former President Obama announced that what he called a permanent ban on offshore oil and gas drilling, along with wide areas of the Arctic and the Atlantic seabed. This was followed quickly in February of this year by our Prime Minister Trudeau, who also declared a moratorium on offshore drilling. Just as a caveat, I understand as of Friday, your current president has once again lifted that ban, but for my story, it's still on. Yeah, he could, so I'm going to stick with what's going on. Sorry, the 2010 licenses. But when this was announced, this offshore ban, it was interesting to see the reaction of the people in the Arctic who said, our people have been working with industry for over 50 years. We've grown skills, we've got employment. Our businesses have grown, the regions have grown. To lose an opportunity on oil and gas for our people is upsetting. One elder told me, we can't just get up and move to where the jobs are. At the same time that these two governments decided to put a hold on offshore drilling, they both announced support for the development of new onshore pipelines. Much of the world's, and this is good news for a province like Alberta, which sits on one of the largest recoverable oil patches in the world. Much of the world's oil is in the form of oil sands, although it is not all recoverable. While oil sands are found in many places of the world, the largest deposits in the world are found in Canada and Venezuela. Now, Alberta's oil reserves play an important role in the Canadian as well as the global economy. It's actually fairly difficult to grasp the sheer enormity of the oil sands operations. Flying over them is really the way I would recommend to do it. The oil sand area covers nearly 140,200 square kilometers, or roughly the size of Florida, a bit larger than England. And in 2011, 536 million barrels of oil were produced. 314 billion barrels of this oil were obtained by digging as opposed to drilling. Now, Alberta, for those who think of it, the Rocky Mountains, it's known for its beauty, but it's also home to 380,000 square kilometers of boreal forest. The circumpolar boreal forest covers about 14 million kilometers squared, or 32% of the Earth's forest cover. And Canada is the world's second largest country, and almost 60% of Canada comprises a boreal forest. This represents 40% of the world's total. And although a variety of industrial activities challenging the integrity of Canada's boreal Canada's boreal forest, a key challenge relates to the activities of the oil industry. So far, 420 square kilometers have been touched by oil activity, but that area could potentially expand as much as 3,000. Again, this represents a fraction of the total land base, but other habitats, of course, are fragmented and interrupted through this process. The actual process of extracting oil from the sand is extremely destructive. It requires cutting down trees, disturbing peat, and draining wetlands. Oil is contained in the soil. So what we call in Canada bitumen, which I understand here you call bitumen, so we call it bitumen. I'm going to speak Canadian here today. Bitumen must first be separated from the sand and then upgraded. So two processes are used to extract the bitumen from the sand. In the first process, surface deposits are accessed by digging up land in a process that resembles open strip pit mining. 2 tons of material must be scraped away, what the industry calls overburden, to produce 1 barrel of oil. 400-ton trucks move the soil to a cleaning facility, where it is mixed with warm water in order to remove the bitumen. This process has been used in the majority of projects. But deposits found more than 75 meters deep are extracted in situ through pumping steam into deep deposits to melt the bitumen so that it can be pumped to the surface. Because of the heavy viscose nature of the bitumen, the in situ method requires even more water and energy resources than the excavation method. And the in situ process is actually used for 80% of the established reserves. A consequence of this process, you may imagine, is greenhouse gas emissions. So temperate, tropical, and boreal forests store tons of carbon. Almost half of this is located in the boreal forest, making it the largest terrestrial carbon storage ecosystem. Oil sands extraction requires scraping up peatland that is acting as a carbon sink. So while the peat is disturbed in the mining process, carbon is released into the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases are also produced in the process of energy production, so making the oil sands one of the largest emitters in our country. So Canada has a dubious distinction as the world's leading greenhouse gas emitter on a per capita basis and has failed to achieve our Kyoto targets. By 2006, our greenhouse gas emissions were 26% over our 1990 levels, despite our commitments the other way. Canada's goal is to reduce our emissions 17% by 2020 to the level of 2005, from the level of 2005. And the United States, of course, has pledged to cut it by the same amount. However, there have been a number of environmental watchdogs and different groups suggesting that our country is not on track to meet these targets. Oil sands production is actually accelerating at breakneck speed. The pace is driven, of course, by demand, interest, and policy. Now, it's interesting, because we've heard a lot of this in the news lately, but NAFTA's proportionality clause ensures that an average percent of our energy resources actually flows south to the United States. The oil sands has quickly become one of the largest industrialized projects in human history. With proposed pipelines and increased production, we'll see that the oil sands span the entire continent. And what's interesting is that the oil sands are located in what's known as the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo. So you can see right here, oh, this thing isn't really working very well, but here you've got the Athabasca River, and this is the Athabasca Delta, and there's the community of Fort Chipewyan, and there's Lake Athabasca. So Alberta's oil sands are located in this region called Wood Buffalo, and the second largest of the 8 communities in this municipality is Fort Chipewyan. It's located about 500 kilometers north of Fort McMurray on the shores of Lake Athabasca, and about 200 kilometers north of the oil sands development. And the Athabasca River actually empties into Lake Athabasca and forms the Athabasca Delta that surrounds the community with a landscape thick in boreal forests, wetlands, veined with hundreds of rivers and swampy muskeg that nourish numerous species. The community was actually founded in 1788, so not too much distance between them and Dartmouth. But Fort Chipewyan is the oldest settlement in Alberta and was a key outpost for the region during the fur trade. While Euro-Canadians from the south typically think of the north as isolated, it has historically been an important site of economic and cultural convergence of people with different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. For the inhabitants of the region, they tell stories, and this goes back to some traditional knowledge, of actually knowing about this sticky substance, the tar sands they called it, and they would use it actually to patch up the holes in their canoes. Now, when the industry first came to the region and decided it wanted to developed the tar sands, and they started in about the 70s, but really didn't become profitable till the late 70s, early 80s. There was the excitement in the region was palpable. When I was, again, I said my first job was working up there. So this is, again, just to give you a sense of geography, Edmonton and where the Fort Chipewyan community is. And again, we talked about treaties and land claims. They are a signatory to a historic treaty known as Treaty 8. So when the oil sands first started to come online, there was almost a sense of enthusiasm for the potential that the industry would offer. And this is a quote from my book. It's not the profits that we are gaining for our First Nation, it's seeing the positive changes that occur within our people as they pursue a better way of life, which comes from steady employment, financial success, independence, and increased self-esteem. And Ed Coudray was the brother of the chief, and he was in charge of a company called 2000 Plus. So as recently as 20 years ago, there was a palpable enthusiasm for the potential that industry could bring to the region in terms of jobs and income and security. And if one looks at what we call in Canada the Community Wellbeing Index, these communities, you can see, register quite high. They use 4 indicators to judge well-being, the 4 indicators being income, education, housing, and employment. So by all accounts, the story of Fort Chip should be a positive one. However, when I went back to visit recently, that was not the case. In fact, if anything, the community has come out very publicly against any future expansion of the tar sands. So why would that be? What's changed in the last 20 years? So I'm going to quickly go over some of these important changes that we see. Starting with environmental degradation, human health, and changes in what we call the political and legal landscape. As the pace of development accelerated, the concerns of local communities about these changes has amplified. Hyper-growth of the oil sands since 2005 has fueled not only wealth generation in local communities, but has also created alarm over the potential effects. The result is deep divisions in already diverse communities, accusations that the government is failing its fiduciary duty to consult communities with respect to development. As the stakes increase, the discourse has become more heated. Some human rights observers now claim that Alberta is committing slow industrial genocide of Indigenous peoples by failing to put the brakes on regional development. Changing northern environments today are commonly understood in terms of human and industrial impacts on the global environment, especially when it comes to climate change. Although Indigenous peoples have a history of adapting to change, the current scale and pace of these changes in this region in particular are unprecedented and accelerating beyond rapidly. To put it in perspective, water from the oil sands comes from the Athabasca River system, which is fed from glaciers at the base of the Rocky Mountains. And that is then drains, as we said, into the Athabasca Delta. This delta is a dynamic wetlands ecosystem that is changing rapidly, and this change has been most notable in recent years. Climatic, hydrologic, biological, and historical data are synthesized to elucidate how the ecosystem has changed over the past 300 years. Annual temperatures are now higher than what it has been. For much of the 1700s, the delta was colder in winter and had a lower flood frequency than the last 30 years. Since the mid-1960s, local and regional mean annual temperatures have increased while winter snowfall has decreased. Major events in the past 45 years include climatic changes favoring a warmer, drier ecosystem, cultural and socioeconomic changes, a building of a dam in neighboring BC, larger fluctuations in water, vegetation, and wildlife, and of course, the development of the oil sands. So you can see a precipitous change in the landscape in the area in the last 30, 40 years. This change has had significant impact on the community. And one of the most notable changes has been the impact on the ability to hunt and trap traditional foods, like muskrat, have completely disappeared. When I lived up there, it was recently 20 years ago, muskrat, we could go out and get them and hunt and find them anywhere, but now getting a muskrat's a real rarity and a real delicacy. The most urgent problem associated with Indigenous for the community residents of Fort Chip is its impact on the environment. Until very recently, the economic livelihood of the community's Indigenous population depended on local animals, fish, vegetation found in the diverse, cold, hardy boreal bioclimatic ecosystem. As such, the natural environment figures prominently in their culture and identity in ways that both converge and sometimes, of course, diverge with the interests of, say, environmental groups. But it's not just the disappearance of actual animals to hunt and trap. Fort Chip fishers have also collected deformed and unhealthy fish from the Athabasca watershed downstream from the oil sands industrial development. This one clearly shows a tumor and was brought to the attention of the University of Alberta researchers and scientists who raised alarm bells and requested the federal government make funds available for a long-term fishing monitoring program. Access to safe drinking water. Of course, I've already mentioned, a vital area of concern is the amount of water used to separate the oil from the bitumen. The estimates are 2 to 4 barrels of water for 1 barrel of oil. Now, existing licenses for the oil sands project will see an annual diversion of 550 million cubic meters of fresh water from the Athabasca Basin. So this represents the water consumption of a city of 2 million inhabitants, so about the equivalent of Calgary. After its use in the oil sands, the water is recycled but eventually becomes contaminated. So the toxic water is stored in huge tailing ponds comprised of a mix of clay, sand, hydrocarbons, and heavy metals. As of January 2013, these ponds, which are basically massive lakes, could be seen from outer space. The trillion-dollar question, of course, is what happens in the future when these companies no longer operate. But in the meantime, there's more of a concern about potential leakage into groundwater in the Athabasca River, of course. And so there are some studies going on to decide whether or not this is occurring. But a lot of this monitoring has been left to industry. This is a picture I took when I was living in Tuktoyaktuk as well, because you have a water issue up in the, across the circumpolar north. That's George Poitras, Dr. John O'Connor, and Chief Alan Adams. So a tipping point in the community came after I had left in 2006, when the community's physician came up there and informed local authorities that he was diagnosing disproportionate high levels of unforeseen or rare cancers. And rather than come to his aid, the provincial and federal health authorities charged him with causing undue alarm. Further, scientists have proven that the levels of metals like mercury, arsenic, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in waters and sediment around Fort Chip are abnormally high. Combined, these metals are known carcinogens that can cause the type of rare cancers found in the community. O'Connor speculated that the environmental changes and contaminants might have negative impacts for human health. So O'Connor asked Health Canada to investigate. And in response, a team of representatives from Health Canada and Alberta Health and Wellness traveled to Fort Chipewyan. Now, according to Dr. O'Connor, one member of the team turned on the tap, drank a mug of water, and told him that there was no cause for alarm. O'Connor described this incident as an insult to the local community, and after years sparring, he was charged with 4 counts of professional misconduct, including withholding data and causing undue alarm. So obviously, he left the community and returned to the East Coast. But what the cancer study did was 2 things for the residents there. First, it alerted them, or for them, they actually say it vindicated them, because they had a sense that they were burying their loved ones all too frequently. And I won't lie, I mean, the amount of people I know who've gotten cancer and died in young people since I've left there is shocking. But second, it created further anxiety because they believed that anyone living in the community was now much more susceptible to becoming afflicted with cancer in the future. However, it was the sanctioning of the doctor that led George Poitras to launch an international campaign denouncing the impact that oil sands development was having on his community, and in particular, the social and health impacts and consequences that he claimed were the result of environmental degradation. So the realization that not only was their local environment being negatively affected, but the potential cancer and health hazards that shocked and motivated the community to internationalizing and calling for a moratorium on any expansion. So Poitras' international bloody oil tour took him to London, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, France, and the United States. Poitras resigned his position as consultation coordinator for Mikisews Industry and Government Relations Department in 2009 out of fear that the Mikisew would suffer repercussions for his outspoken activism. Now, Sean Bell, who's a reporter for the Slave River Journal, quotes an email he received from Poitras as saying, "Because of this very successful campaign in the UK, one of the oil company's executives flew to Fort Chip and attempted to force the hand of the First Nation to silence or terminate his employment with the Mikisew, because they didn't like that he had traveled internationally and that by doing so he generated so much negative publicity for the oil sands industry. As he tells it, quote, Apparently, we are not to speak publicly if we observe water quality issues, health impacts, or worse, our people dying too frequently of cancers. This, they said, was not consistent with the company's vision, and if Mikisew didn't support its vision, there would be repercussions. And there were repercussions. Many Mikisew employees lost their jobs on this particular company's site within weeks, end quote. It would soon become to be called the Oil Sands Bloody Oil Tour. And since then, they have, much to the dismay of local community, become increasingly worried. When the cancer study was released, oh, sorry, I've already said that part. Okay, so what we see is calls for moratoriums are increasing as the internationalization of the anti-oil and gas movement has spread, not just across Canada, but across the continent. So where 30 or 40 years ago there was some hope associated with the potential that oil and gas might provide to local communities, now you see increasing concern about the potential negative impacts extraction may have on communities' access to traditional resources or basic elements like clean drinking water. Historically, Indigenous communities have been excluded from decisions about resource development, and it's been done to them without their consent. But now, in Canada in particular, our legal system is repeatedly changing so that government has now a duty to consult with these communities, and they have a voice in approving and shaping projects located on their land. Now, in some places, the extent to whether these precedents have empowered Indigenous communities is yet to be seen, but what is clear is that at least at the international level, there is a clear call for increased Indigenous consent before these projects can start to take place. So we see really a contradiction at the heart of the Arctic, and not just even the Arctic economy, but you see elsewhere. There's dependence on these extractive economies and industries to satisfy material well-being, yet at the same time, these same economies serve to undermine that material well-being. The only way to mitigate this contradiction from a policy perspective is to implement a land use regime that respects the right of Indigenous peoples to provide, or I say withhold, their free, prior, and informed consent. So, the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the General Assembly on Thursday, 13th of September, 2007, by a majority of 144 states, with 4 voting against. Anyone want to guess who the 4 voting against were?
Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand.
Correct. Bingo. Canada, Kansas, as they're called at the UN, for their alliance. Now, I'm happy to report that all 4 have since joined on, Canada signing on last in 2016. But what it stands for, what it calls for is, and I know I've met quite a few people in the industry who are quite concerned about the implications of this, but FPIC, free, so free from coercion. P is prior, meaning consent is meaningful only if it is provided before a project begins. And informed. That Indigenous peoples must be provided with all the information about the potential impacts of a proposed project. This means they must have access to adequate baseline data to conduct impact analyses and that are funding to employ experts to conduct independent analysis. This is a picture of a slide. I just happened to be walking around Fort Chip one day, and this was just on the wall in the multiplex, and I took it because I thought it sort of encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about here today. So to begin to wrap up, many Indigenous communities face the prospect of large-scale resource development occurring, and they're doing so with either a mix of optimism but also apprehension. The capacity to take advantage of resource development opportunities is definitely a key challenge for many of these communities. And these communities that face the large-scale resource development with a mix are torn, and as you can see, this is just a survey of the community, and what was prioritized within this community was the environment. And if you go across, health. So, to conclude, Indigenous peoples across the Arctic and, of course, elsewhere seek a sustainable economy, a secure environment, and a say in their future. Across the Arctic, indeed, one might say across the globe, we can see Indigenous environmental politics has been once again activated. Although there is some hope still in some places that resource development will bring tangible benefits to northern Indigenous and Aboriginal communities, there are still very deep concerns about the adverse effects it may have on the environment and, of course, the traditional cultures and value systems that rely on it. Development has already transformed relations with the land, creating new politics in which they have both adapted to and challenged. The clash of large-scale developments, the employment and economic benefits they can bring with the preservation of traditional economies can be divisive and difficult to resolve. Today, for some, there is more hope that these conflicts can be better managed through the structures of co-management, corporate development, and self-government created by the region's land claim agreements. Thank you. That's it.
So we have time for a few questions or comments, discussion. Lay it out.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle.
Go back. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle, for your talk today. I have several questions, but I'll start with the idea that the Indigenous well-being is somehow linked to the extractive sector. In my research, what I've seen is as the extractive sector is promoted across the North, Indigenous communities are no longer communities, are no longer polities, but are only labor forces. So training programs develop in order to support Indigenous peoples only as employees for the mines or the oil sands. I was wondering if you shared that experience, if that's your perception as well. And if you could comment on that, please.
I think that has definitely been historically the role. A lot of the Indigenous communities in Fort Chip work as, during shutdown or, during cleanup or as, service the industries. What you see in a lot more, like with the Aboriginal Pipeline Group, is trying to come up with new ways to actually be at the table as opposed to simply servicing the industries. Again, impact benefit agreements often talk about jobs and training. And I think, as I pointed out, one of the key elements and challenges is simply capacity. Again, Northwest Territories, the poor education passing rate, the fact that they're bringing, I gotta give Syncrude credit. They are the ones who required grade 13, or grade 12, I guess it is, to be a high school certificate because people were just not even going to high school and just going to work for the oil sands. And they said, no, we want you to have at least a high school education. It doesn't even have to be in the north. You see, Attawapiskat has high unemployment, but De Beers is operating right by it. Why is that the case? So I think I was just actually speaking with the federal government, advising them, and one of the things I said is you've got to look at that disjuncture, and it's not just, again, about coming in and doing some education, but how to get Indigenous peoples into these jobs. I mean, how many students are there in universities these days? I know I mentor a ton of them and so forth. So I think there's still that huge gap. And I mean, when you only look at the governments across the Arctic and how many non-Indigenous peoples are brought up north to fulfill those roles due to the lack of capacity. So I think right now the focus for a lot of industry is on labor. And I think going to things like the Canadian Aboriginal Mining Association meetings, I see other companies like Syncrude really, they actually have scholarships they can't give away every year. So they are trying, but I don't know what the gap is, but it's very slow. I mean, we see it as academics as well. We were just doing a report on the amount of Canadian research chairs in Indigenous topics and how many of them were non-Indigenous still. So I think that's almost a gap across spectrums, not just the industry. Thank you. Hi again. You're gotten for punishment. You come to all my talks.
Yeah, I guess I like your topic area.
I thank you very much.
I guess I just had a question going back to how the permits are issued. I noticed that there are some areas that were prohibited. And so how are those lands designated? Is that just based off of kind of what the Canadian government deems, or do the tribal communities and the Indigenous communities have a say in that as well?
That's an awesome question. Okay, so it's a mixed bag across the country. In the Yukon, the First Nations governments have, I believe, 8% of subsurface rights out of their territories. In the Northwest Territories, I don't believe they have any subsurface. I'd have to look at Clicho to see. Nunavut has some, but for instance, they have no offshore at all. Some areas, so in negotiating a land claim or self-government agreement, many land claims, what happens is the federal government will say, how much land do you want? And they'll say, okay, we're going to set aside so much for development, and the rest you can use for traditional territories. This has become a problem in the Northwest Territories where the Decho have said, we want 50% set aside for non-development purposes, and the feds have said, no, it's going to be 5. And there's no agreement because they aren't agreeing. So it can depend. It can be a federal government area, but generally, so north of 60, the federal government has to sort of permit, the National Energy Board gets involved, but south of 60, it's the provinces. It's a very complicated process, which is one of the reasons that the Mackenzie Valley has taken so long. And a lot of industry in the Mackenzie actually has pulled out to start fracking because it's faster and cheaper and can get done quicker. So to answer your question, you got to go in and figure out the landscape to figure out where you're getting your permitting from. And that's one of the biggest problems with American companies coming up to Canada. If they don't do their homework, as we see in certain provinces, they basically get run out of town. So it's a totally different landscape. I don't have a very simple answer because it's very complicated. It's a really good question, though.
Thank you for a very interesting, definitely a hard story to listen to, but laid out very well. So I really appreciate how hard it was to even get to that prior informed consent spot, and that is obviously a step forward. But I'm left feeling like wondering if there's at all any serious conversation going on about a much deeper, more transformative approach to the people, the Indigenous people in this area actually truly self-determining more sustainable paths of development for themselves. Because what it seems like what's happening here is not only suicidal for them, but if we were to continue mining all those fossil fuels and burn them, it's going to be suicidal for us globally too. I mean, based on what the latest projections are about what it'll take to decarbonize and avoid the most, staying well below 2 degrees, as the Paris Agreement said, by the turn of the century. So, I mean, the dilemma seems like even bigger scale than the way you laid it out, and I'm just wondering what you've heard or what you know about any other efforts to think about a fundamentally different pathway for some form of sustainable development where the Native peoples don't have to essentially destroy their culture and destroy their relationship with the land to achieve that.
Canada as a country is very focused on its resources. Basically, if you can dig it, cut it down, fish it, we'll give it to anybody, we'll take it basically. And as a result, as a country, we've had that sort of in our mindset. And in the North in particular, it's been very much promoted. Because of the high levels of unemployment, especially in places like the Northwest Territories where gas was founded so long ago, and it's been like waiting for Godot. It's been waiting and waiting for this opportunity, and it never really seems to come to fruition. Now, it's interesting, I was just reading how in Fort Chip, they actually want to bring up some solar panels, but they want industry to pay for them, which is interesting. So they're saying, even though industry's made it so we can no longer hunt and trap, and basically the tar sands are the new trap lines is what they're saying. They want that same industry to come in and start looking at renewable resources. I've seen in Colville Lake in Northwest Territories, they're trying to bring in some renewables. But you've got to remember, this is a large jurisdiction where that water sign is because when I'm living in Tuktoyaktuk, there's, the permafrost is melting, but in my apartment or house, I've got a big barrel full of water, and I can see the water levels, and the water truck comes around twice a week. So I have to conserve my water in order to just, do dishes or whatever. Most of the communities are running on diesel generators, right? So we're taught, there's no road. So there's a lot of the basics that have to sort of be overcome. Now, academically speaking, definitely in the academic community, the dialogue is definitely about not engaging with resource development and so forth. From a community level, a lot of people just want to feed their kids. And, they just want a job, and they want money to put in their, their skidoos, then go out in the land. So, there's this sort of academic, we have this luxury of sort of saying, oh, we want to get off carbons, but then for other people, as I said, there's this very material desire to just, like I said, food is ridiculously expensive. When I went to Old Crow, I got there, and the store had no food. I basically spent $30 for nacho chips and salsa, and that's all I lived off for a week and was foraging because they couldn't get the food up to the store. So, material needs are very, very acute in the Arctic. So I think it's great for us to have these conversations and to, find ways, but we have to be mindful of some of the real pragmatic challenges of thinking differently outside the box when the box is actually just all you want at the time. So it's hard. It's hard, especially when we're down here and we think we know it all, we have all the solutions.
So if I could follow up on that, my research thus far has focused south of 60. And south of 60, the conversation has evolved from IBAs to equity. So Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, developing equity agreements rather than impact benefit agreements with the extractive with industry. And so the new sort of marker for autonomy in dealing with industry becomes equity agreements with the prospect of outright ownership and outright Indigenous ownership of mines. And we're seeing that at Muskowhegan, one First Nation in Saskatchewan. Are the same sort of conversations happening in the north of 60?
When I asked some leaders about that, I said, why didn't you, just start doing it themselves? They said, we don't have that money to go to the table, which is why this Aboriginal Pipeline Group was considered, you don't mean that? You mean just,
No, I do mean that, but I don't know, that's not true. There's $2 billion in capital.
Well, when I asked, because I said, oh, you got a land claim, you got $35 million, they said, no, that's for the oil sands, that's not even, that's what they spend on office supplies in a year, that's not even a drop in the bucket. So they just said to me that wasn't even on the table. But that's why this Aboriginal Pipeline Group was such an interesting idea. And I went and met with them in Calgary. And basically, it's, I'm trying to think of the company, is it TransAlta? The company that basically has provide them office space and given them a startup with the idea that all 5 of the communities that are impacted have a stake. And depending on how much impact it is in your territory, you will have more stake. So that was considered a radical approach. Actually, there's a new mine in New Brunswick that's having an interesting approach. There's a new relationship going on there. And I was approached originally about the communities challenging that mine, but now there's this really creative agreement where the government's going to buy up land in order to compensate for the land they take, which is unseen anywhere else. So in the north, right now, Nunavut is an interesting case. And the other thing is they have 2 mines, but they turned down uranium mining and they turned down seismic testing, again, because of the impact on animals, and they didn't want uranium mining. But there's also a theory that there's only so much labor and only so much they need to go on. I would say the Yukon might be a place. You might see more of that, especially where you have First Nation governments that have now been in place for about 20 years, so that they've got a lot more foundation. And they have subsurface rights, so they have more leverage. The Northwest Territories, the Nunavut, obviously, very dynamic. They are very pro-oil and gas, but the further south you go, the less pro-oil and gas you get. So there's a lot of politics, I think, at the end of the day that come into play. And even within commute territories, I've heard of stories of one community saying, we want an impact benefit agreement with you, and the producer, the person fracking, said, well, we'll give them the rest of the jobs, and they said, no, we don't want them getting the jobs. So that's a whole other can of worms. So equity, I think right now most people are looking at resource royalty sharing, that they want the rents that accrue from this exploitation. Equity partners would be great, I think, in terms of going back to your original question of capacity building, right? And actually seeing them become more engaged in that process as opposed to just laborers.
Well, I think we probably should stop now. We have a reception upstairs, which is generously provided by the Consul General's office in Canada. I want to thank Lee McDavid for helping organize the event. Ambassador Dan Benjamin, director of the Dickey Center, is here, also going to be upstairs. We have lots of different viewpoints and perspectives on these issues within this room. So why don't we go upstairs to congratulate Gabrielle on an excellent talk.